My father didn't even bother lowering his voice. "Do we really have to stand next to a homeless-looking woman from New York?" He asked, his smile too wide, loud enough for 200 guests at his Christmas gala to hear. My brother Daniel leaned in, his voice sharp and urgent. "Anna, don't embarrass me. These people are above you." I stayed exactly where I was. Borrowed heels, a plain black coat. Every eye in the room found me, then slid away the practiced dismissal of people who knew instinctively which bodies belonged in which spaces. No one defended me, no one ever had. To them, I was the daughter who had vanished and failed in silence. The laughter that followed my father's comment was a scattered, nervous sound like a tremor in the room. A woman near the champagne table pressed her lips together, not in sympathy, but in the quiet satisfaction of witnessing someone else's disgrace. A man I didn't recognize nudged his companion, whispered something, and they both turned away with the coordinated ease of people who had already decided I didn't warrant further attention. I watched my father smooth his tie, that familiar gesture he made when trying to appear composed. He didn't apologize. He pivoted toward a couple near the bar, already launching into some story about his latest business venture, acting as if calling his own daughter unattached in front of 200 people was simply a witty prelude to the evening. My stepmother Margaret stood 3 feet away, her smile fixed and fragile. She made no move toward me. Margaret had perfected the art of being present without being involved. She could stand beside a disaster and somehow convince everyone she'd been looking the other way. Her fingers adjusted her bracelet, a small, deliberate motion that communicated to anyone watching that she, too, had noticed the stain I represented and had chosen to remain untouched by it. Daniel caught my eye from across the room. "My brother." He gave me a look that wasn't sympathetic. It was a clear, cold warning. "Stay small. Stay quiet. Don't make this situation any worse." I'd seen that look before, at my graduation when I tried to introduce college friends, at every moment when I dared to exist as something other than a shadow in the background of their carefully curated life. The ballroom was stunning. My father had rented the grand hall of the Hartford Club, a space steeped in old money and older traditions. Crystal chandeliers scattered light across walls lined with oil paintings of long-dead founders. The Christmas tree stood 15 feet tall, decorated with ornaments that cost more than my first monthly rent. Everyone here was someone. And now here I was, his greatest embarrassment, standing in the middle of his triumph like a flaw that wouldn't lift. I remember the moment I decided not to leave. That's what the old Anna would have done, the one who believed that making herself smaller might eventually make her easier to love. But I'd spent 7 years becoming someone who understood that the space you occupy in a room isn't given to you. It's claimed. So I stayed. I found a spot near one of the tall windows where the December cold seeped through the glass and offered a sharp reminder that I was still alive. Outside, snow had begun to fall, soft and indifferent. A server passed with a tray of champagne, his eyes moving through me as though I were furniture. He didn't offer. I didn't ask. That's when I saw him enter. Thomas Reynolds, the name on every invitation. Reynolds Capital was the kind of firm that didn't need to return phone calls from people like my father. I watched Thomas work the room, moving without rushing, how people angled toward him like plants toward the sun. He had the kind of presence that money alone can't buy. My father intercepted him near the bar, hand extended, smiling too wide. I could read the raw desperation in his posture, the slight forward lean, the way his free hand gestured too broadly, trying to manufacture importance. Thomas was polite. He shook my father's hand, nodded at something said, and then his eyes moved past my father's shoulder. They found me across the room. I didn't look away. For a moment, neither of us moved. My father was still talking, gesturing toward Daniel, now trying to weave a narrative of success and family achievement. But Thomas wasn't listening anymore. He excused himself. I saw my father's face fall, the confusion flickering before he composed himself. Thomas was walking toward me. I thought about the first time I'd met him in a conference room overlooking Central Park. I'd been wearing a consignment suit, my resume printed on borrowed paper. He'd asked me one question in that interview. "What are you afraid of?" I told him the truth. I was afraid of becoming someone who needed permission to exist. He'd hired me on the spot. Now 7 years later, he was crossing my father's ballroom with that same curious expression. He stopped in front of me. The conversations nearby faltered, then stopped entirely. Someone's champagne glass paused midway to their lips. "Anna," he said, and the way he said my name made it sound like a promise kept. My father materialized beside us, his social radar finally engaging. "You two know each other?" he asked, his voice falsely light. Thomas looked at him, and I saw the shift from politeness to a quiet, pointed disbelief. "Of course," he said. "She's your boss." The room went completely still. Even the ambient noise of clinking glasses and shuffled feet seemed to hold its breath. I watched my father's face cycle through confusion, suspicion, and then something that looked undeniably like fear. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Thomas wasn't finished. "Anna is the majority shareholder of Reynolds Capital. It has been 3 years. I assumed you knew." I hadn't told them. I'd let them believe I was nothing because nothing was the only role they'd ever offered me. My father's hand trembled as he reached for his champagne glass. Around us, the whispers began spreading through the crowd like a rising tide. I looked at Daniel. His face was pale, his jaw slack. I looked at my stepmother. Her fixed smile had cracked, revealing something raw beneath. I looked at my father, the man who'd called me unattached in front of everyone he wanted to impress. And I realized this night wasn't about proving who I'd become. It was about standing in a room full of people who'd dismissed me and discovering that their opinions no longer held any weight. They'd spent years forcing me to feel small. Tonight, they were the ones who didn't know where to stand. I didn't notice it happening at first. No one ever does when the extraction is gradual. After graduation, I took a job that sounded impressive enough to silence my father, junior analyst. The company name carried enough weight to suggest a future. He nodded once the way he used to when something barely cleared the minimum bar of his expectations. That should have been my first warning. The office wasn't overtly cruel. Everyone smiled. Everyone talked about opportunity like it was a prize you earned by waiting your turn. I arrived early because presence felt like protection. I stayed late because unfinished work had a way of migrating to my desk, even when it wasn't officially assigned to me. People stopped asking if I could help and started assuming I would. It felt like validation in the beginning. It always does. "You're good at this," someone said, once glancing over my shoulder as I corrected numbers that weren't adding up. "You just see the inconsistencies others miss." I smiled and said thank you. I didn't question why those others were already partners. By winter, my desk had become the quiet destination for problems. Not on the official roster, just loose ends that needed tidying, files that needed cleaning. Clients no one wanted to manage, but everyone wanted handled successfully. When a senior associate missed a deadline, the work quietly slid toward my corner. When a presentation needed salvaging, I was added to the email chain late just in time to fix it, and just early enough to be blamed if the entire effort collapsed. I stopped counting hours. I stopped leaving my laptop at home. In meetings, I watched people explain conclusions I had reached alone at midnight, speaking with the confidence that came from knowing they would never be questioned. I learned to keep my face neutral when my own words came back to me in someone else's voice. No one lied. They simply omitted my contribution. Performance reviews came and went. My manager sat across from me. "You're incredibly dependable, Anna," he said, hands folded. "That quality is rare." Dependable, not promising, not moving forward. When I asked about growth, he hesitated a fraction of a second that told me everything. "You do excellent work," he said carefully, "but leadership roles require presence, visibility. You tend to fade into the background." I nodded, because nodding had become a reflex. I left the review with a heavier workload and the distinct feeling that I should be grateful for the additional burden. The project that finally cracked my composure arrived without ceremony. A volatile client with a history of threatening litigation. Legal gray areas no one wanted to touch. The kind of account that could erode the firm's reputation quickly. Everyone senior enough had already declined. The file appeared on my desk at 4:47 on a Friday afternoon. No meeting, no explanation. Just a note from my manager. "You're steady. We trust your reliability." Trust is a burden when it isn't paired with protection. The first week I worked until 2 in the morning every night. The second week, I stopped going home entirely. I kept a change of clothes in my desk drawer and showered at a gym 3 blocks away. By the 4th week, I had developed a minor hand tremor that appeared whenever I tried to hold a coffee cup steady. I learned details I was never supposed to know. I took responsibility for decisions no one else would endorse. When the client threatened to pull the account over a clause I hadn't written, I was the one who flew to Chicago on 6 hours' notice to sit in a conference room and absorb his anger for 3 hours, while my manager attended his daughter's recital. When my strategy prevented a significant financial loss, the relief in the office was almost audible. The partner presented the results. At the celebratory dinner, my manager raised his glass and thanked the team effort. I sat at the far end of the table and clapped along, my hands aching from weeks of effort, my name absent in a way that now felt calculated. That night, I didn't weep. I sat on the floor of my tiny apartment laptop still open, my hands still shaking. I hadn't eaten a full meal in 3 days. My reflection in the dark window looked like someone I didn't recognize, hollow-eyed, gray-skinned, a machine running on fumes. The realization didn't arrive as insight. It arrived as exhaustion too complete to sustain the necessary illusions. They weren't mentoring me toward partnership. They weren't preparing me for advancement. They were utilizing me because I was reliable, because I absorbed pressure without pushing back, because I lacked the powerful connections that would force them to be careful with me. I thought of my family then, of how my usefulness as a caretaker after my mother's passing had been mistaken for love. The pattern felt devastatingly familiar. I started paying attention, not with anger, but with absolute clarity. I noticed who spoke freely and who waited for an invitation, who was forgiven for catastrophic mistakes and who was quietly removed from the circulation list. I watched how credit consistently moved upward while accountability flowed down. It had nothing to do with intelligence. It had everything to do with who could afford to leave. 3 weeks after the celebratory dinner, my manager dropped another last-minute task onto my desk as I was gathering my things. It was the 4th time that month. "Can you handle this tonight, Anna?" he asked casually. I looked at the file, then at him holding his car keys, his coat already on. The word came out before I had consciously decided to say it. "No." The pause that followed was the loudest sound I had ever heard in that office. "I'm sorry." His voice carried genuine confusion, as if I had spoken in a foreign language. I said no. My voice was steady, though my heart was hammering. "I'd like to understand how this specific task fits into my defined role moving forward." "Well," he said, choosing his words carefully, "we all need to be flexible to grow in this environment." I nodded slowly, putting my bag down. "I have demonstrated flexibility," I said. "Now I require clarity." After that, the air between us became thin, not outright hostility, but a sharp suspicion. I was still given work, but now there were guarded glances. When I didn't immediately volunteer for extra work, someone else had to, and the inconvenience showed on their faces. For the first time, I understood what had always been true. They hadn't valued me because I was quiet and competent. They had valued me because I didn't resist. And the moment I did, even politely, I became an inconvenient problem. I didn't resign. Not yet. I stayed long enough to map the machine, long enough to learn where the real leverage lived and what information was truly valuable. They thought they were draining my potential. They didn't realize I had stopped pouring myself into their system. Quietly, methodically, without telling a soul, I began preparing for a career that didn't require anyone's permission. They never noticed, and that, in the end, was their irreversible mistake. The conversation that formally severed my life from my family happened on a Saturday afternoon in April. I remember the weight of the day, knowing I should have been studying for final exams in my New York apartment, but instead driving back to Connecticut. My father's voice on the phone had been clipped professional, demanding my presence to discuss something important. I knew instantly it wasn't good news. My father never called me for celebrations. I arrived just after noon. Margaret's prize roses bloomed along the meticulously kept walkway. Daniel was already there, sitting rigidly in the living room, avoiding my gaze. "Anna," my father's voice cut through the silence, Come into the study, please. The study was always his place of judgment. Dark oak leather chairs, walls lined with books that served as decoration rather than reading material. He sat behind his desk like a monarch about to deliver an edict, with Margaret standing guard beside him. I sat in the chair across from him, the same chair that had absorbed a decade of his disappointment in me. "We need to talk about your future," my father began, his hands clasped on the dark wood. I waited. "Margaret and I have been discussing your situation, and we're deeply concerned about the professional path you've chosen." My situation. I was a problem, a variable that needed to be managed, not a person to be respected. "I'm on track to graduate with high honors," I stated, keeping my tone flat. "I have 3 competitive job offers in finance already." "In New York," he countered, emphasizing the city's name as if it were a synonym for recklessness. "Yes, in New York." He leaned forward, a practiced, persuasive gesture. "We think you should reconsider. Come home. I can get you a position at the firm. Daniel will be taking over the Hartford office eventually, and we could use someone discreet to handle the administrative side." Administrative side. After 4 years of relentless academic and professional struggle to reach the top ranks of my university. "You want me to be Daniel's secretary?" I translated, meeting his gaze. "Don't be deliberately dramatic, Anna. It would be a high-level management position. Eventually. It provides stability." I looked at Margaret. Her face was neutral, but the small tightening around her eyes revealed the satisfaction. This was her victory, me back under control, positioned to serve the legitimate heir. "And if I refuse?" My father sighed, a sound heavy with exaggerated patience. "Anna, we are trying to offer you a safety net. New York is a merciless place, and those jobs you're considering, they demand connections you simply do not possess. They are not secure." He meant I didn't have a trust fund. I didn't have a network of family friends waiting to catch me. Daniel would inherit everything. I would inherit nothing but a lifetime of being told I wasn't enough. "I have myself," I said, a quiet conviction in my voice. "That is my connection." He shook his head dismissively. "This stubborn streak is precisely the issue. You feel this need to prove something. But the world doesn't reward raw effort, Anna. It rewards people who understand their position. People like me." The words chilled me, though I'd expected them. "What does that phrase mean exactly?" I asked. "It means you need to stop pretending you're a force of nature. You're my daughter, and that comes with certain family expectations. Stop acting like you're an independent powerhouse." I stood up slowly, driven by an instinct beyond conscious thought. "Your daughter," I repeated, letting the mockery fill the word. "I haven't felt like your daughter in years. I've felt like an inconvenience, a problem you hoped would quietly resolve itself." Margaret intervened smoothly. "Anna, we're trying to help you. You've been struggling on your own for so long. Let us provide structure. Structure to do what? To disappear more completely into Daniel's shadow." I glanced toward the doorway. Daniel still fixed on his phone, feigning deafness. "Daniel!" I called out, my voice cutting across the room. "You have no opinion on this, on me being asked to come home and be your subordinate." He looked up startled, then quickly lowered his eyes. "It's not like that, Anna. Dad just thinks it would be better for you to be closer to family support." "Family?" I laughed, the sound sharp and painful. When was the last time anyone in this family stood up for me? When did I last feel like I actually belonged here? The only answer was a heavy silence. My father's expression hardened. The facade of the concerned parent vanished. "If you leave," he stated, his voice now flat and definitive. "If you walk out of this house and go back to New York against my wishes, you are entirely on your own. Don't expect any financial support. Don't expect any professional connection ever. I will make it clear to everyone in my network that you chose to sever ties. You will not use my name as a reference. You will not claim any connection to this family in any professional context." The threat was precise, surgical. He wasn't just cutting me off financially. He was threatening to poison the well. "I've never expected anything from you," I replied. "You made sure of that years ago. Then understand this. Don't come back when it falls apart. Don't show up here financially ruined and without work expecting us to save you. You choose the path you live with the absolute consequences." I looked at him, searching for the slightest trace of the father I remembered from my early childhood. He wasn't there. "I understand the terms," I confirmed. He nodded once, a sign that he considered the argument closed, and himself the victor. "One final thing," I added. "When I leave, it won't be because I failed to meet your standard. It will be because I chose a life infinitely better than the one you're offering. And when everything I build proves you wrong, don't you dare rewrite the history. Don't claim you supported me. You forfeited that right the day you decided I wasn't worth your time." Margaret's composed expression flickered into surprise before she could recover. My father's jaw tightened. "If you walk out that door, don't bother coming back until you're someone of consequence." I walked to the study door. My hand was on the brass handle when I felt it, a tremor running through my entire body, the visceral pull of wanting him to stop me, wanting him to say something that would make this unnecessary. He said nothing. I turned back. "When I come back, Dad," I promised, my voice steady, despite the tremor, "you won't recognize me. And by then, your opinion won't matter at all." I drove back to New York that night. For the first hour, I kept glancing at my phone on the passenger seat, waiting for it to light up. A call, a text, anything. The screen stayed dark. I didn't pack anything from my childhood room. I left the photographs, the old trophies, the ghost of the girl I used to be. I had anticipated devastation or anger. Instead, I felt an intense, liberating lightness. The weight of trying to conform to a space that was never meant for me had finally lifted. I was truly alone with no one to call if the world turned against me. But I was also undeniably free, free from the hope that they would change, free from the cycle of small humiliations, free from the lie that love had to be earned through perpetual self-diminishment. My father had issued a challenge, "Don't come back until you're someone." I accepted. New York didn't welcome me with open arms. The city demands tribute first. It takes everything you thought you knew about yourself and grinds it down, testing what core substance remains. I arrived with a junior analyst job offer that paid just enough to secure rent in a cramped shared apartment in Washington Heights. 4 roommates, 1 bathroom, a constant smell of old pizza and ambition. My bedroom was a narrow box. It was supposed to be temporary. It lasted 2 years. For the first time in my life, I was utterly anonymous. No one knew my family name, my past, or the diminished story they had assigned to me. I was just another hungry 22-year-old chasing a future that had yet to materialize. My job was at a small investment firm in Midtown. Not a recognizable name, but respectable enough. My title meant I executed whatever tedious task the higher-ups deemed beneath their time. They noticed the effort, but not the person. Not at first. I learned quickly that working hard was insufficient. The city was saturated with people working 80-hour weeks just to hold their place. Hard work was the minimum entry fee. Advancement required something entirely different. The first real crisis came in my 3rd month. My roommate, a paralegal who worked nights, moved out without warning, taking the security deposit and leaving me responsible for her share of rent. I had 11 days to find $300 I didn't have. I sold my laptop, the good one my mother had given me before her passing. I bought a used replacement for half the price and ate instant noodles for 6 weeks until the shortfall was covered. No one at work noticed the weight loss. No one asked why I stopped going to lunch. It took me 18 months to isolate the key difference between the people who advanced and the people who stayed frozen. 18 months of arriving early, staying late, and watching people with half my diligence move past me like I was standing still. In my first year, I flagged an error in a deal analysis that would have cost the firm significant money. I sent the correction to my direct supervisor. He forwarded it to his supervisor without my name attached. The partner who presented the corrected analysis received a bonus. I said nothing. I noted the lesson. I was staying late one evening in my 2nd winter compiling a complex report that had been carelessly dropped on my desk at 4 o'clock with a morning deadline. The office was quiet. I heard footsteps and looked up to find Marcus Chen, one of the senior partners, standing in the doorway of my cubicle. "You're still here," he observed, not questioning it. "Finishing the Hartwell report," I replied. "Who assigned that to you?" "Peterson." "Peterson." He repeated the name with a bad taste. "That report was his core responsibility. He's supposed to present it tomorrow." I offered no explanation. "What do you think of the deal, Anna, the Hartwell acquisition?" I hesitated. No one had ever asked for my opinion, only my mechanical output. "It's excessively risky," I said, finally choosing my words carefully. "The projections rely on an assumed 15% growth rate, but the company's sector has averaged 7% over the last 5 years. Either the firm has non-public information, or someone is relying on the assumption that nobody will bother to scrutinize the math." Marcus studied me for a long moment. "You scrutinize the math?" "I always check the math," I confirmed. He stood up, buttoning his jacket. "Finish the report, include your analysis, but place it in a separate appendix. Put your name on that appendix." He walked away. The Hartwell deal collapsed 3 weeks later. Someone had indeed relied on sloppy math. Peterson was quietly escorted out of the building. Marcus Chen summoned me to his office the next day. "You have good instincts," he said, looking over the cityscape. "But instinct is merely observation. You need to learn strategy to deploy it." He became my unofficial mentor. Marcus taught me not about finance, but about the anatomy of power, how it moves through rooms, how it hides in plain sight. But mentorship didn't protect me from the daily grind. In my 3rd year, I made a calculation error on a minor deal. The client noticed. My manager called me into his office and told me I was lucky the client was forgiving, that another mistake like this would be noted in my file. The error had originated in data provided by a senior analyst who was the nephew of a board member. Producing that evidence would cost me more than silence. I absorbed the warning. I started triple-checking everything, including work that wasn't mine. "Your family," Marcus remarked once. "You never discuss them." "There is nothing of consequence to discuss." He sipped his wine. "Everyone has a history. The only real question is whether they own you or you own the story." I thought of my father's study. "They believe I am an irrelevance, a failure who foolishly ran away to a city that will eventually consume her." Marcus set down his glass decisively. "That, Anna, is your greatest advantage. The most effective opponent is the one no one is watching." I didn't fully grasp his meaning then. I was 34, and I was about to embark on the next level. I moved out of Washington Heights, then into a small, entirely private apartment in Brooklyn. I changed jobs, moving to a larger firm where the stakes were exponentially higher and the lessons more brutal. I stopped posting anything public. The few perfunctory calls from home ceased entirely. By the time I turned 27, I had become someone entirely unrecognizable to my family. The girl who was easily erased was still there, but now she was armored. I was ready for the next level. They never noticed. And that, in the end, was their irreversible mistake. No one offers a course on how to see what others miss. It's not a skill you acquire in a classroom. You develop it the way a body grows scar tissue, layer by layer, each small trauma leaving behind something tougher and more insightful than what was there before. My ability to anticipate problems, to notice the subtle inconsistencies in data and behavior, came directly from years of being invisible. When everyone looks past you, you learn to look at everything else. The most vital information isn't in the formatted reports or the polished presentations. It lives in the silences, the quick glances, the things people reveal when they believe no one who truly matters is paying attention. At the second firm I joined, there was a managing partner named Victoria Ashford. She was 63, had been in the business for 40 years, and possessed a severe reputation for destroying careers with a single skeptical glance. The junior staff actively avoided her moving to the stairs rather than sharing an elevator. I sought her out. It wasn't bravery, it was calculated necessity. I studied Victoria in meetings. She rarely spoke first, and almost never spoke at all, unless her words would irrevocably change the direction of the conversation. When she finally spoke, entire rooms would reconfigure around her authority. I needed to understand the mechanics of that power. I started staying late on days I knew she was in the office. Our workspaces were on the same floor, hers, a corner office with commanding views, mine a cubicle near the rattling copy room. I found reasons to walk past her door to be visible to her without ever being intrusive. One night, about 3 weeks into my strategy, she called out as I passed, "You're the analyst who flagged the meridian error, aren't you?" I stopped in her open doorway. "Yes." "Come in, close the door." Her office was minimalist, every surface clear, except for her laptop and a heavy crystal glass half filled. I sat in the chair she gestured to. "Why did you catch it?" she asked without preamble. "I'm sorry." "The error. 3 senior analysts with decades of experience reviewed that deal before it came to your desk. None of them saw the discrepancy you flagged." "Why did you—" I considered the question. The honest, simple answer was also the most potent truth. Because I didn't have the option to assume it was correct. Victoria watched me over the rim of her glass. "Most people assume correctness. It's faster, it's easier, it requires less personal risk. I don't have the luxury of assuming anything." "And why is that, Anna?" I met her sharp, unflinching gaze. "Because if I am wrong, there is no one who will defend me. I don't possess the kind of background that affords second chances." Something subtle shifted in her expression. Not sympathy, which Victoria seemed incapable of, but a sharp, clinical recognition. "Good," she said, nodding once. "Use that deficiency." Victoria became the second indispensable person in my New York education. Where Marcus had taught me the physics of leverage, Victoria taught me the applied art of deploying it. How to recognize, accumulate, and use critical information before someone else weaponized it against me. "Information is the only currency that truly matters," she told me once. "Not money. Money is merely how people without access to key information attempt to keep score." But before I could deploy information, I had to survive the consequences of being right. The first time I corrected a senior colleague's analysis in a meeting, the room went cold. The colleague, a man named Harrison, who had been with the firm for 15 years, smiled at me with his mouth only and said, "Thank you for that perspective, Anna." Within a week, I was reassigned from his project team to a dead-end compliance review. The second time, I learned to route my corrections through Victoria, first letting her present them as her own observations. The credit flowed upward, the protection flowed down. Under her demanding supervision, I developed the skill that would eventually make me invaluable. I learned to spot non-obvious patterns in data, to predict market shifts, not through predictive formulas, but by understanding the specific fears and motivations of the individuals making the decisions. Numbers tell a portion of the truth, but the ultimate truth resides in the human element. My skill was tested fully during a major firm decision. The partners were considering acquiring a high-growth tech company that looked immaculate on paper. Everyone was celebrating the impending bonuses. I spent 3 weeks scrutinizing every filing. Something felt fundamentally wrong, but the balance sheets were pristine, too pristine. The first 2 weeks yielded nothing. I followed threads that led nowhere, a vendor relationship that seemed unusual, but proved legitimate, a revenue recognition pattern that looked aggressive but fell within accounting standards. I began to doubt my own instincts. On the 14th night, I almost gave up. The deal was scheduled to close in 10 days. The partner championing the acquisition had already started discussing integration timelines, but the wrongness persisted. Something I couldn't name. I dug deeper, focusing on subsidiary filings, working backward through 3 years of amendments to corporate structures. On day 17, I founded a shell company registered in Delaware that held the majority of the tech company's liabilities. The debt was absent from the primary financials because technically it belonged to a different entity. However, that shell was wholly owned by the founder, meaning the debt would be absorbed by the acquirer US. I presented my findings to Victoria. She looked at the documentation for exactly 90 seconds before picking up her phone. 2 hours later, the acquisition was dead. The partner who had championed the deal, a veteran of 20 years, was asked to clear his office by the end of the week. No one outside that small circle knew I had been the one to uncover the catastrophic flaw. Victoria ensured my anonymity. "You are not ready to be visible," she explained calmly. When you take credit for ending a deal this large, you create powerful permanent enemies. If you create enemies before you have the power to survive them, you will not survive at all. So I maintain my invisibility, for now, but there is a crucial difference between being invisible because others dismiss you and being invisible because you choose it. The first is a weakness. The second is a powerful strategic advantage. I thought of my family all the years I was erased against my will. Now I was choosing my own erasure, and the choice made all the difference in the world. The firm's subsequent success was attributed to cautious, smart leadership. My name appeared nowhere in the annual report, nowhere in the press releases. But Victoria knew. And more importantly, I knew. It was then that I began building something entirely my own. It started small. On weekends, I tracked opportunities the firm had ignored, deals that didn't fit their rigid portfolio but held non-obvious potential. I analyzed sectors they'd overlooked, companies too small to attract their established attention. But analysis without capital is academic exercise. I had saved aggressively since my first paycheck, living in apartments smaller than what I could afford, declining the lifestyle inflation that consumed most of my peers. By my 5th year, I had accumulated enough for a meaningful seed investment, not life-changing money, but enough to have skin in the game. I made 3 small investments in my first year of quiet independence. 2 failed completely. The third returned my capital with modest gains. The failures taught me more than the success. I learned that being right about potential meant nothing if the founder couldn't execute, if the timing was wrong, if 100 variables I hadn't considered conspired against the outcome. I wasn't planning to leave the firm immediately, but I was preparing for a singular independence. The opportunity that changed everything came from an unexpected source. A founder I'd met briefly at a conference reached out looking for seed capital for her education technology platform, designed to help first-generation college students navigate financial aid. The numbers were modest but compelling. The market was underserved. And the founder's pitch, her fierce, unyielding drive, reminded me so much of myself at 22. I knew no one who would be interested in this scale of investment, but I knew someone who might know someone. I called Marcus Chen. "There's something I want to show you," I said. "It's not for the firm, it's for an independent strategic investment." He was quiet for a long moment. "Dinner, Saturday. Bring everything you've developed." That dinner was the inaugural step toward everything that followed. Marcus didn't invest himself, but he introduced me to someone who did. And that led to another introduction, which led to another, until I wasn't merely an analyst anymore. I was quietly constructing a foundation that no one could take away from me. The invitation arrived on a routine Tuesday afternoon, nestled between emails about compliance and quarterly reports. It bore a name I recognized instantly, but had never corresponded with Eleanor Vance. She ran Vance Partners with a quiet, terrifying authority that ensured even the most aggressive voices in finance lowered their volume when speaking to her. The message was brief, formal, and deceptively simple. A private gathering at her home the following week. The theme was Emerging Markets in the Coming Decade. My attendance was requested, not demanded or required. That was the language of people who knew their request was functionally a command. I had heard of Eleanor's gatherings the way one hears about secret societies. They were never publicized, never discussed in the press, and never appeared on social media. What happened at Eleanor's residence stayed there, protected by the mutual understanding that everyone present had a considerable reputation to protect. Victoria had told me once that these gatherings were where real decisions were made, not in boardrooms, but in private libraries over expensive scotch, where handshakes meant more than contracts. The night of the gathering, I wore a midnight blue dress I'd commissioned for an occasion I hadn't yet defined. It was simple, perfectly cut, expensive enough to belong, but restrained enough not to scream for attention. In rooms like this, overt flashiness was the quickest route to dismissal. Eleanor's townhouse, located on the Upper East Side, was one of those limestone monoliths that whispered of permanent, entrenched wealth. A woman in a dark suit took my coat and led me through a foyer lined with abstract art I knew was priceless. The gathering was held in the library, a room paneled in warm wood, lined with leather-bound volumes and furnished with antiques. There were perhaps 25 people in attendance. I recognized a prominent senator, a hedge fund manager whose name dominated financial news, and a woman who had been on the cover of Forbes the previous month. And then there was me. Anna Chen, 30 years old, with no recognizable family name, no established history, and no obvious reason to be standing among this elite. I secured a drink and positioned myself near the tall windows, allowing me to observe without being conspicuous. The conversations were exactly what I expected: market trajectories, central bank policy implications, and geopolitical risk assessments. I was listening to two men debate the volatility of emerging market bonds when Eleanor Vance appeared at my elbow. "Anna." Her voice was soft but measured, the tone of a person who never used a single word by accident. "I'm genuinely glad you could accept the invitation." "Thank you, Ms. Vance. It's an honor." "Victoria speaks of you in unusual terms. That is not something she does lightly." I kept my expression neutral. Victoria Ashford and Eleanor Vance were peers, two formidable women who had spent decades climbing unforgiving corporate ladders. If Victoria had vouched for me, it carried immense unseen weight. "I owe a great deal to her instruction," I said. Eleanor smiled slightly, a gesture that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm certain you do, but I am far more interested in what you have managed to learn on your own initiative." Before I could formulate a reply, she was gone, touching another guest's arm, already absorbed in a different strategic conversation. I was left by the window, trying to decode the 2 minutes that had just occurred. The rest of the evening felt less like a party and more like a continuous, subtle examination. People approached me, introducing themselves and asking questions that seemed conversational but were clearly designed to probe my knowledge. What was my view on the Fed's latest minutes? Had I processed the new report on Asian credit markets? What was my personal take on the shift toward long-term sustainable investing? I answered meticulously, saying enough to confirm my expertise, but not enough to reveal my operational strategies. In this world, information was the ultimate currency, and I was not ready to spend mine freely. Around 9 o'clock, the main discussion consolidated near the massive fireplace. A loud, supremely confident man began arguing vehemently against a proposed regulatory change affecting how private equity firms could structure leveraged buyouts. His tone was dismissive, assuming his sheer volume equated to validity. He was making a significant legal error. He was conflated two different provisions of the proposed law, and his entire opposition was built upon this structural misinterpretation. Either he hadn't actually read the full text, or he was certain no one else present had. I remained on the periphery observing. But Eleanor, standing near the man, must have caught a flicker of my reaction, because suddenly she addressed me. "Anna," she said, and the room went silent. "You appear to have a perspective that isn't being voiced." Every eye in the room pivoted to me. I felt the concentrated pressure of their combined attention, the absolute realization that being seen here meant being judged instantaneously. If I spoke and was wrong, I would never be invited back. If I spoke and embarrassed someone powerful, the consequences could follow me for years. "Not a perspective, Ms. Vance," I clarified. "A factual clarification." I explained the error in his argument, citing the specific provision numbers. I detailed why the two sections were mutually exclusive and precisely what the regulation's actual, rather than assumed, impact would be on deal structure. My voice remained calm, my tone purely objective, my words surgically precise. When I finished, the loud man's face was flushed, a deep, uncomfortable red. The room remained silent for a long, necessary moment. Then Eleanor nodded a brief, affirming motion. "Thank you, Anna. That context is critically important." The conversation immediately pivoted, abandoning the man's flawed position. I could feel the atmosphere shift around me, the subtle recalibration of every person's interest. I had spoken, and I had been definitively correct. In this ecosystem, that combination was both rare and inherently dangerous. The man I had corrected found me later near the bar. His expression was pleasant, controlled. "Impressive," he said. "Not many people would have risked contradicting me in this particular room." "I didn't contradict you. I corrected a factual error." "Semantics." He smiled, but his eyes were cold. "I'll remember this conversation, Ms. Chen." He walked away before I could respond. As I was leaving, I noticed a distinguished silver-haired man watching me from near the door. His face suggested he had witnessed enough in life not to be easily impressed. He didn't approach. He simply nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement, and turned away. I learned his name the following week when Victoria mentioned that Thomas Reynolds had asked about me. "Asked what?" I said, keeping my voice neutral. "Who you were, where you came from, whether you were as sharp as you appeared or simply lucky." "What did you tell him?" Victoria's expression didn't change. "I told him luck had nothing to do with it." It would be another 4 months before Thomas Reynolds and I spoke directly. 4 months of being in the same rooms, nodding across crowded gatherings, building a recognition that neither of us rushed to formalize. When he finally approached me at a smaller dinner, fewer witnesses, his first words were not flattery. "You've been patient," he said. "I've been watching," I replied. "The same as you." He smiled, then the first genuine expression I'd seen from him. "Victoria was right about you." He reached into his pocket and produced a thin, elegant card. "When you reach the stage where you are ready to construct something significantly larger than your current structure, call me directly." He was gone before I could formulate a response, disappearing into the night like a powerful disruptive possibility. I stood on the sidewalk holding the card that felt unnaturally heavy, realizing that the independent life I had so carefully constructed was about to be irrevocably changed. The first time someone actively attempted to derail me, I didn't recognize it for what it was. That is how the best manipulations work. They never feel like an attack. They always feel like a coveted opportunity. I had been at the firm for 4 years when Martin Price, a senior partner, decided I was the permanent solution to all his professional shortcomings. Martin was a man who had been consistently promoted beyond his genuine competence and spent his days carefully managing the illusion of his productivity. He possessed an incredible talent for claiming credit for successes and effortlessly deflecting all subsequent blame. He started subtly. A request for discreet assistance on a report he was struggling with. A late-night email asking me to sanity check a complex financial model. A casual mention that he was profoundly impressed with my diligence and wanted to begin collaborating more closely. I was initially flattered. I should have recognized the alarm bells. Within 6 months, I was effectively executing half of Martin's official duties while he retained his full salary and bonus potential. I was the one who worked past midnight fixing his strategic missteps. I was the one who caught the numerical errors in his client presentations. I was the anonymous engine that made him look brilliant and highly competent in front of clients who would never even learn my name. The arrangement was positioned as mentorship. It was in practice a form of professional parasitism. Martin developed habits. He would forward emails to me at 11 at night with a single line, "Thoughts by morning." He would add my name to project teams after the kickoff meeting, ensuring I inherited responsibilities without input. He would schedule strategy sessions that were actually requests for me to prepare his talking points for his own meetings. When I tried to set boundaries, suggesting that some requests fell outside my role, he would grow quiet, then mention casually how competitive the upcoming review cycle would be, how important it was to have senior advocates in one's corner, how easily promising careers could stall without the right support. The implicit threat was never spoken directly. It didn't need to be. The breaking point arrived during an acquisition deal that should have cemented both our careers. It required months of meticulous due diligence negotiations that ran into the early hours of the morning and a level of strategic foresight that Martin was entirely incapable of. I supplied the foresight. Martin supplied the confident public presentation. In the final week before closing, I made an error. Sleep-deprived and running on caffeine, I transposed 2 figures in a sensitivity analysis. The error was minor. It didn't change the fundamental recommendation, but it was the kind of mistake that could be weaponized if someone wanted to use it. Martin found it. He didn't mention it to me. Instead, he mentioned it to a senior partner in passing, framing it as something he had caught and corrected himself, adding that perhaps Anna was taking on more than she could handle. I learned about this secondhand from a colleague who thought I should know. I fixed the error that night. I also started keeping copies of every email, every document, every timestamp that showed who had actually done the work. When the deal successfully closed, there was an extravagant celebration in the largest conference room. Champagne was poured freely, formal toasts were given, backs were slapped. Martin stood at the center accepting congratulations like a hero returning from a victorious campaign. My name was mentioned exactly once in a quick dismissive aside as someone who had efficiently helped with the foundational research. That night alone in my small apartment, I looked at the business card Thomas Reynolds had given me 6 months prior. I still hadn't called. I continued to tell myself I needed more tenure, more unassailable credentials, more proof that I was worth the immense risk he represented. But the real reason was much simpler. I was terrified. Terrified to leave the stability of a known system, however flawed. Terrified to step into a stratosphere where I would be judged solely on my own name without the safety of a major team to fade behind. Terrified that my family's lifelong judgment was right, that I was only ever destined to be an excellent invisible support system for someone else's true ambition. I carefully placed the card back in my drawer. But the next day, I stopped working weekends for Martin Price. The change wasn't confrontational. I simply began saying no to all requests that fell outside the clearly defined scope of my duties. When Martin asked me to overhaul his presentations, I politely informed him I was dedicated to my own priority assignments. When he attempted to schedule urgent late-night strategy meetings, I had immovable prior conflicts. His reaction was immediate and revealed the entire foundation of our transactional relationship. "You're being incredibly selfish, Anna," he hissed one afternoon, cornering me by the office's beverage station. His voice was low, tightly controlled, the tone of a man whose habitual entitlement was being challenged. "I've personally invested significant capital in your development here. The minimum you owe me is to be a cooperative team player." "I am a team player," I responded, meeting his gaze. "But genuine teams require contributions from more than a single member." His face darkened, losing its polished sheen. "You are making a serious, irreversible mistake. People like you require people like me. Without my direct sponsorship, you will stagnate at this firm." I thought about all the midnight hours I'd spent salvaging his reputation while he slept peacefully, all the credit he had effortlessly absorbed for my original ideas, all the times he had strategically placed himself between me and any opportunity for deserved recognition. "Perhaps," I conceded, "but I have decided I would prefer to fail on my own honest terms than to succeed spectacularly on yours." The retaliation was swift, calculated, and perfectly predictable. Martin began systematically excluding me from crucial operational meetings. My name was removed from critical projects I had personally been leading. Quiet whispers began circulating through the executive floor. I was difficult. I harbored a chip on my shoulder. I wasn't a team player, after all. A senior associate stopped me in the hallway to mention with false concern that she had heard I was struggling with the workload. Another colleague asked if everything was okay at home. The whisper campaign was professional, deniable, and devastatingly effective. I recognized the entire playbook, not from business texts, but from my own family dynamics. The systematic isolation and erasure of the individual who refused to accept their designated subservient role. The same tools, merely in a different professional setting. This time, I was fully prepared. I meticulously documented every interaction, every email, every meeting, every single project I had single-handedly contributed to. I preserved time-stamped copies of my work, creating an undeniable paper trail of authorship. I built a comprehensive case, not for litigation, but for absolute ironclad defense. When Martin attempted to claim authorship of a massive analytical presentation I had written from concept to conclusion, I was ready. The partners' meeting was his intended grand moment. He delivered the deck brilliantly. He was always an excellent, charming performer. The analysis was comprehensive, exactly the strategic work the partners valued. At the conclusion, a senior partner asked a highly technical, specific question about the underlying data framework. Martin hesitated, just a slight fractional pause of uncertainty. But in that room before those specific people, even a flicker of doubt was fatal. Perhaps Anna could provide that detail, Victoria said calmly from her seat. Since she developed and constructed the entire analytical framework used in the presentation, the room snapped into focused silence. Martin's victory smile evaporated. Victoria produced a clean document, the same presentation, but with the digital metadata clearly displaying the true author and creation timestamps. I firmly believe in giving credit precisely where it is due, she stated, addressing Martin directly. Do you not agree, Martin? The meeting concluded shortly thereafter. Martin wasn't immediately terminated, he still had too many political ties for that, but his internal trajectory instantly shifted to terminal decline. The promotion he expected went to an external candidate. His reputation for brilliance was permanently tarnished. I felt no celebration. I had merely defended my position. The tremendous energy I'd spent protecting myself was energy that I could have invested in building. That night, I retrieved Thomas Reynolds's business card from the drawer and dialed the number before I could talk myself out of it. "This is Anna Chen," I said when he answered. "You told me to call when I was finally ready to do something bigger." "I remember the conversation perfectly," he said, his voice calm, entirely devoid of surprise. "Are you ready now, Anna?" I thought about Martin Price, about my father, about every single person who had ever tried to force me into a mold of convenient smallness. "Yes," I confirmed, the word resonating with certainty. "I am ready." The transition to Reynolds Capital happened faster than I could have anticipated. Thomas Reynolds was a man who measured minutes like currency. He wasted no time on prolonged interviews or conventional reference checks. He openly admitted he had been observing me for months, ever since that night at Eleanor Vance's gathering. He already knew my track record, my distinct strengths, and my history of being the person who quietly executed the critical work while others took the credit. What he offered me was unprecedented. It wasn't a mere job. It was a partnership structure, an opportunity to co-invest directly in early-stage ventures, allowing me to build and manage a portfolio entirely my own within the larger protective framework of Reynolds Capital. In exchange for my unique analytical abilities and my quietly developing network, I would receive significant equity, complete operational autonomy, and something I had never possessed, a powerful, influential person who was actively betting on me instead of consistently against me. The only condition was absolute discretion. I had to leave my current firm with zero drama, no internal grandstanding, no public bridge burning, no tell-all exit interviews. Thomas valued my skills, but he valued silence and strategic invisibility even more. In his world, the people who constantly talked about power were the ones who possessed the least of it. The requirement complicated everything. Martin's whisper campaign had already damaged my reputation internally. If I left abruptly, the narrative would be that I had been pushed out, another difficult woman who couldn't handle the pressure. If I stayed too long, Martin would find another way to undermine me. I spent 3 months preparing my departure with surgical precision. I methodically wrapped up all my active projects, seamlessly transitioned key client relationships, and ensured that nothing would collapse in my absence. The people who had blindly relied on my work would continue to receive the same quality, just not from me. During those months, I slept poorly. I ran scenarios in my head at 3 a.m. What if Thomas's offer fell through? What if Martin discovered my plans? What if the transition cost me everything I had built? The anxiety was a constant pressure behind my eyes, a weight I carried alone because there was no one I could safely tell. My resignation letter was exactly 2 paragraphs long, professional, expressing detached gratitude, final. Martin Price learned I was departing before my final day. I caught him watching me from his office door, his expression an unsettling mix of relief and something close to naked fear. Without me to perpetually clean up his errors, he would finally have to perform or face his own inevitable exposure. He approached me once near the elevator, attempting something that might have been reconciliation. "I hope there are no hard feelings, Anna," he said, his voice carefully modulated. "We made a good team." I looked at him for a long moment. "We were never a team, Martin. You were a client I couldn't bill." I walked away before he could respond. On my final afternoon, Victoria Ashford stopped by my desk. She didn't say goodbye, that wasn't her style, but she handed me a small, heavy box wrapped in silver paper. Inside was a wristwatch. Simple, heavy, and elegant, the kind of piece that cost significantly more than my first year's salary at the firm. The back was engraved with a crisp, stark sentence: "Time is the only resource that can't be recovered. Use yours wisely." "Thank you," I said, meeting her eyes, "for everything you taught me." She gave one sharp nod. "Don't thank me, Anna. Succeed. That is the only gratitude I require." Reynolds Capital operated out of a pristine glass tower in Midtown, the kind of building that announced its importance silently. My new office was on the 32nd floor, a smaller space than the partners' suites, but larger and more luminous than anything I had ever occupied. It had a window that faced east, toward a personal future I was finally ready to define on my own terms. Thomas Reynolds's approach to leadership was vastly different from Victoria's clinical precision or Marcus's philosophical distance. He operated largely on instinct, trusting his gut about people and deals in ways that often defied conventional metric-based analysis. Under his expansive guidance, I learned that sometimes the best strategic decision was the one you couldn't fully justify in a spreadsheet. "The numbers tell you what happened," he explained during one of our early strategy sessions. "The right people tell you what will happen. Learn to read the people, and the financial metrics become a necessary but secondary footnote." I applied his philosophy immediately to my first major co-investment, a complex healthcare technology startup that every other analyst had dismissed. The founder was notoriously difficult. The core technology was unproven on a large scale, and the potential market was currently uncertain. Every standard metric suggested walking away entirely. But I had spent hours meeting the founder. I listened to her story, watched how she talked about patients, about fundamental outcomes, about closing the massive gap between healthcare promises and actual delivery. She possessed a fierce, burning conviction that reminded me of myself at 22, desperate to prove an idea, willing to burn her life down to see it realized. I convinced Thomas to take the meeting. Then I convinced him to authorize the initial investment. Over the next 4 years, I worked alongside the founder, helping that startup navigate the minefields. The first 18 months were brutal. A key technical hire quit a competitor, emerged with deeper pockets. A pilot program with a major hospital system collapsed over regulatory concerns. I considered walking away twice. Both times I stayed. The company didn't become a thriving success overnight. It became a company that survived long enough to find its market. When we finally exited a strategic acquisition, not the IPO, the founder had dreamed of, the return was strong. Not 40 times our initial stake, closer to 12. But 12 times earned over 4 years of genuine difficulty meant more to my reputation than any fantasy multiple. The years that followed were not a straight line. By 32, I had built a portfolio that looked impressive on paper, but included 2 significant losses that kept me awake at night. By 33, I had secured a seat at tables I once couldn't have entered, but I also watched a deal I championed collapse in ways that nearly cost me Thomas's confidence. By 34, I had learned the difference between success and invincibility. I was the former. I would never be the latter. But I had accumulated the one element I had longed for since that conversation in my father's study. I had undeniable proof. Not that I needed it for them anymore. I had stopped needing their validation years ago. But there is a distinct difference between not needing something and not wanting the finality it represents. I didn't need their approval, but part of me still wanted them to fully grasp the colossal mistake they had made. Not for retribution, but for the closure of an open, painful chapter. The final conclusive opportunity arrived unexpectedly. Thomas announced his retirement in the fall of my 7th year at Reynolds Capital. He had been planning it for years, he admitted, but hadn't known who possessed the vision and ethical rigor to carry on the legacy he had built. Until me. The transfer of majority ownership took 18 months of intense legal and financial maneuvering. By the time the final regulatory approvals were secured, I was the majority shareholder and named CEO of one of the most respected private equity firms on the East Coast. I was also, according to the business press, that finally started paying attention, a certified billionaire. The word felt strange when it was first formally attached to my name. Money, I learned, doesn't fundamentally change who you are. It simply removes the constant obstacles that prevent others from seeing you clearly. My family learned about my existence and my success the same way everyone else did, through major financial headlines, glossy magazine profiles, and the occasional television segment. I never reached out to them. What was the appropriate dialogue? Look at me now. Remember when you declared I would never amount to anything? The satisfaction of that confrontation was always far better in my imagination than it would be in an awkward, meaningless phone call. What I craved was not recognition. It was complete, permanent indifference. The ability to hear my father's judgmental voice in my memory and feel absolutely nothing at all. I was almost there. The Christmas gala invitation arrived in early December, forwarded through so many layers of professional intermediaries that it took time to trace its origin back to my father's office. His annual holiday celebration, the event I hadn't attended in 12 years. This year, Thomas Reynolds was listed as the official guest of honor, the man my father had been trying desperately to meet for decades. Thomas called me the day the invitation arrived. "You know, Richard sent this," he said. "He has no concept of our current relationship. He believes I'm coming to celebrate his continued business success." I looked out my window at the Manhattan skyline, at the concrete and glass city that had tested me, tempered me, and turned me into someone my family would never comprehend. "I know," I said. "Are you going to accept the invitation?" I thought about the girl who'd stood in that dark study, told she was essentially worthless. I thought about the woman who had quietly constructed a massive empire from the rubble of that rejection. I thought about the immense space between those two individuals. Yes, I set a sense of cold, perfect finality settling over me. I'm going. Not for retribution, not for vindication, but because some narratives demand a definitive ending, and this one had been left open for far too long. The 2 weeks preceding the gala felt like the absolute calm before a storm I was no longer afraid of facing. I went about my work attending board meetings, closing complex deals, flying across time zones, and all the while I was intensely aware of what was coming. The feeling was not dread, but a profound, almost detached curiosity. The first definite sign that their reality was fracturing came from Daniel. He called on a random Wednesday evening. I didn't recognize the number, but his voice when it came through the speaker was tentative. "Anna," and he said my name like he was testing whether he still had the right to use it. "It's Daniel, your brother. I know who you are." A pause. "I wasn't actually sure you'd even answer my call." I almost didn't. He cleared his throat, that nervous sound I remembered from childhood. "Look, I know we haven't been close. I know things were complicated when you decided to move. But Dad's having the party, and I was wondering if I'm planning to attend. Are you—" I let the question hang there, savoring the uncertainty in his voice. Daniel had been shielded from uncertainty his entire life. Our father had smoothed every path. "Yes," I said finally. "I'm coming." "Oh." He sounded genuinely surprised, then tentatively relieved. "That's great. That's actually really great news, Anna. Dad will be pleased." I profoundly doubted that last sentence, but I didn't correct him. "I have to ask," Daniel continued, his voice taking on a more probing tone. "Are you doing okay? Financially, I mean, because if you need help with travel or clothes or anything." "I don't need help. I'm just saying, if the city has been tough, there's no shame in—" "Daniel," I cut him off. "I don't need help. I'll see you there." After hanging up, I sat with the phone for a long time, thinking about the boy Daniel used to be. I wondered if any trace of that boy still existed beneath the carefully tailored corporate identity he'd become. The next sign came from an entirely unexpected source. I was attending a formal charity gala in the city. A woman approached me near the bar. She was my approximate age, possessing the impeccable polish of someone raised within the same Connecticut social circles as my family. I didn't recognize her, but she clearly recognized me. "You are Anna Chen," she confirmed. "Richard Harris's daughter." I was. "Today I am just Anna Chen," she offered a quick, knowing smile. My mother went to school with your mother, Emily. She used to talk about how lovely she was. I've been quietly tracking your career. What you've managed to build is genuinely spectacular. Thank you. I also know, Anna, that your family currently has no idea who you have become. She leaned in slightly. I attended a dinner party last month. Your father was there. When someone finally asked about his other child, he dismissively said you were finding yourself in New York. Finding yourself. As if you haven't found enough capital to financially dominate everyone in that entire room. I maintained my neutral expression. Finding myself. The casual dismissal that I was still the lost, directionless girl. He doesn't know the truth, I confirmed. None of them do. The best outcome, I said, meeting her gaze, is the kind where they have no one to blame but themselves. They didn't look because they didn't want to see. And now Thomas Reynolds is attending their Christmas party, as my guest. Thomas Reynolds, the one your father has been actively trying to secure a meeting with for decades. The same Thomas Reynolds. And he knows about you, about your actual position. I allowed myself a rare, slow smile. He knows absolutely everything. The woman laughed, a sound of genuine, unbridled delight. I genuinely wish I could be in that room to witness their faces. You absolutely can be, I said. I am permitted to be a guest. And so 2 weeks before Christmas, I arrived at my father's gala with a distinct advantage, a witness. The girl who left had nothing but raw determination. The woman who returned had everything else. Tonight everyone was about to fully comprehend that distinction. The ballroom looked exactly as my memory preserved it. The same blinding crystal chandeliers, the same somber oil paintings, the same careful assembly of entrenched money and institutional power. Yet it felt entirely different because I was different. My companion for the evening was Catherine. We entered together, two women, generating a quiet, inevitable ripple of attention. My father spotted me almost instantly. He was standing near the entrance, playing the gracious host, shaking hands with the forced sincerity of a politician. When he saw me, his carefully composed expression fractured. Surprise, then rapid confusion, and finally a flicker of outright alarm. I crossed the room directly toward him. Anna. He said my name like it was an unfamiliar word he was testing for meaning. You actually came. You sent me an invitation, Dad. I didn't think you would bother. He caught himself rapidly recalibrating his social persona. It has been a significant time. You look well presented. Thank you, I replied, ignoring the awkward phrasing. He glanced at Catherine, struggling to place her in his mental hierarchy. And your friend, Catherine Moore, her mother knew mine years ago. The mention of my mother always had that slight disruptive effect on him, a reminder of the time before Margaret, before the slow erosion of our family unit. It's good to see you, he said, the words practiced and completely hollow. Daniel mentioned you'd achieved some success in New York. A good position, he said. Did he? Yes, something about a recent promotion. He was visibly fishing, I realized. He had no true understanding of my life, no grasp of the vast empire I had built in the years of his definitive absence. Anyway, welcome. Please make yourself at home among the guests. Make yourself at home. In a room full of people who had watched him call me unattached 2 years ago, the layered irony was almost unbearable. I moved through the gathering with Catherine exchanging polite greetings with various distant relatives who looked at me with confusion, as if trying to match my current appearance to a dusty childhood photograph. An elderly aunt who had meticulously tracked every one of Daniel's accomplishments finally asked what I was currently doing these days. A perpetually bored cousin asked if I was still living in that hectic city. I replied to them with vague, pleasant non-answers and watched their eyes inevitably slide past me toward more recognizable sources of power. They still didn't know. To them, I was the disappointing footnote, the daughter who had run away and predictably failed. The first definite crack in that rigid assumption came moments later. A distinguished man whose face I placed from various financial interviews approached me near the champagne table. He had the quiet, focused confidence of a person who no longer needed to rush anything. "You're Anna Chen," he stated. "I am. Marcus Chen's protege, I believe." He smiled warmly. "I suspected you might be here tonight. I sit on the board of a late-stage company we've been trying to get Reynolds Capital to look at. By any chance, would you have the time for a quick preliminary conversation?" The question was posed loudly enough that several surrounding guests turned instantly. I saw their expressions change, the subtle, forced recalculation that occurs when an invisible person is suddenly revealed to be a powerful target. "I'd be happy to schedule a formal conversation through my office," I responded calmly. "Reynolds Capital." The aunt who had asked about my job repeated the name, her voice carrying a significant distance. "You work at Reynolds Capital." I hesitated. The answer I had prepared, calm, controlled, delivered with perfect composure, suddenly felt like a performance. For a fraction of a second I considered softening it, qualifying it, making the truth easier for them to absorb. Then I remembered 1,000 small moments when they hadn't softened anything for me. "I own Reynolds Capital," I clarified simply. The silence that followed immediately choked the surrounding air. I watched the profound, instantaneous transmission of the information. It traveled from one shocked guest to another in barely concealed stares and sharp, disbelieving whispers. "Own." The single word hung in the quiet air like an absolute, undeniable verdict. My father appeared at the edge of the rapidly growing cluster. His face had gone completely bloodless. "That is impossible," he stated, his voice tight and uneven. "Thomas Reynolds owns Reynolds Capital. I have personally been attempting to secure a meeting with him for years." "Thomas retired," I informed him, keeping my voice level. 18 months ago, I purchased his entire majority stake." "You purchased it?" He paused, his mind visibly struggling to process the immense scale of the fact. "How could you possibly afford to—" "Dad!" Daniel had suddenly materialized beside him, his expression tight with frantic embarrassment. "Maybe we should discuss this privately." "No, I demand to understand this." My father's voice was rising, his meticulously maintained composure finally cracking. "My daughter, who I haven't heard from in over a decade, is suddenly making ludicrous claims about owning one of the East Coast's premier private equity firms." "I am not making a claim," I corrected him. "I am stating a publicly verifiable fact. You can confirm it with a simple search on your phone." Someone in the stunned crowd was already doing precisely that. I heard the tap of fingers on a phone screen, followed by a sharp, collective intake of breath. "She is correct," a woman's voice confirmed, astonishment heavy in her tone. "Anna Chen, majority shareholder and CEO of Reynolds Capital. According to the recent Forbes profile, she is currently valued at—" She trailed off, apparently physically unable to vocalize the number. The room was now perfectly, deafeningly still. I looked directly at my father, the man who had demanded I not return until I was someone who had casually called me useless, who had spent a decade erasing me from his family narrative because I was an uncomfortable fit. "Thomas Reynolds is listed as the guest of honor tonight," I said quietly, ensuring every frozen face could hear me. "He is attending this gala because I personally asked him to be here, because I decided it was time my family met the man who believed in me when they chose not to." My father finally made a sound, a strangled, desperate mix of a laugh and a choke. "Built it," he whispered hoarsely. "She was supposed to be a nobody. She was merely finding herself in some tiny New York apartment." Thomas's expression became cold. "Richard," he said, his voice quiet but carrying absolute authority, "I'm not here to rewrite your family history. I'm here because Anna asked me to be." He paused, letting the implication settle. "Everything else you need to know is a matter of public record." The silence that followed was the moment that changed everything permanently. I looked around at the faces of my distant relatives, the aunts and cousins who had never asked about my life, the stepmother who had spent years making me feel acutely unwelcome, and the father who had definitively told me I would never be anyone of consequence. And I felt a profound, satisfying emptiness. Not triumph, not anger, not even vindication. Just the quiet, powerful knowledge that I had decisively won a game that they were utterly oblivious they were participating in. The evening continued mechanically as all formal events must, but the fundamental atmosphere had been irrevocably altered. The party that my father had intended to be his annual triumphant showcase of personal and corporate success was now solely defined by an unforeseen, crushing revelation. Every conversation, regardless of its starting topic, seemed to inevitably orbit around me, even when I was standing deliberately across the room. Thomas remained by my side, not physically shielding me, but strategically anchoring my position. His mere presence served as a constant, powerful reminder to every guest that their long-held narrative about me had been permanently supplanted by a documented, highly public truth. The formal toast portion of the evening arrived, the part where my father traditionally delivered a lengthy, self-congratulatory speech, thanking everyone for their loyalty. He took the temporary stage at the front of the ballroom, clearing his throat into the microphone with the weary air of a man who had entirely lost control of his own script. "Thank you all for taking the time to be here tonight," he began, the words coming automatically devoid of his usual conviction. "As many of you know, this annual gathering is a chance for our firm to celebrate the past year's victories and look forward to the next." He paused a significant, uncomfortable gap. His eyes scanned the crowd and found me. "It is also, of course, a chance for our families to converge," he continued, his voice thin and forced. "And I am particularly pleased that my daughter Anna was able to join us this year." The acknowledgement caused another immediate ripple through the room. I saw eyebrows arching higher, people leaning in to whisper a repetition of the earlier devastating fact. "Anna has been diligently pursuing her career path in New York." My father continued, the strain now audible in his voice, "and I am naturally proud of everything she has managed to accomplish." Proud. The word resonated in the air like a profound, transparent lie that everyone present immediately recognized as false. A distinguished man near the front tables raised his hand, overriding the polite silence. "Richard, if you'll excuse the directness, is the information correct? Is your daughter the current CEO and majority owner of Reynolds Capital?" My father's jaw visibly tightened. He hesitated, then issued a tiny, defeated nod. "That appears to be the undisputed case, yes. And you were entirely unaware of this fact until tonight." The question, asked with an innocent journalistic curiosity, was professionally devastating. How could a father remain entirely ignorant that his own child had risen to become one of the most powerful, successful business leaders in the country? The question itself exposed a catastrophic failure of attention and familial connection. Our family has unfortunately been focused on different and distinct priorities. My father managed, struggling to maintain his composure. "We experienced a period where we sadly lost touch over the years." Lost touch. The man repeated the phrase, turning it over like a cheap, damaged coin. "I see." The truncated speech that followed was short, halting, and intensely awkward. My father had clearly prepared long remarks detailing his own firm's modest successes, Daniel's assumed inevitable rise in the company, and the powerful family legacy he was diligently constructing. Now those words sounded utterly hollow, rendered irrelevant by the revelation that the very family member he had permanently dismissed had silently built a financial entity that overshadowed his entire life's work. When he finished speaking, the applause was polite, immediate, and noticeably muted. The real inescapable damage occurred in the professional conversations that immediately resumed. I happened to overhear two of my father's longtime business associates standing near the bar area. I still cannot believe Richard didn't know this about his own daughter. More crushing than that, he spent years telling people she was the difficult one, the absolute failure who refused to follow his prescribed program. He told clients she was utterly unremarkable. And now she could buy his entire struggling company with the change in her expense account. They didn't realize I was standing close enough to hear every syllable, or perhaps by that point, they simply ceased to care about his delicate feelings. My father's desperate attempts to network through the remainder of the evening were total failures. Conversations that should have revolved around his quarterly achievements kept inevitably circling back to pointed questions about me. Did he possess intimate knowledge of the healthcare deal? Had he seen the stunning profile published in Fortune? Did he fully comprehend that his daughter's firm currently managed more liquid assets than the GDP of most small countries? Each casual question was another precise small-scale humiliation, delivered not with malicious intent, but devastating nonetheless. Daniel finally found me late in the evening. He looked profoundly exhausted, the kind of crushing weariness that comes only from having one's fundamental worldview permanently rearranged. "How long?" he asked, his voice low and barely audible. "How long, Daniel? How long have you been—" He gestured vaguely, unable to find the precise words to describe what I had become. "Successful approximately 8 years. Majority owner of the firm, 3 years officially." He nodded slowly, struggling to process the timeline. "And you deliberately never told us anything. You aggressively established the rule that you would never ask. I did call you, once or twice over the years. You called me to see if I was in such need I would accept money, and to see if I was still pathetic enough to create a social embarrassment at holidays you didn't even genuinely invite me to attend." He flinched violently at that last sentence, a small, involuntary movement that confirmed I had struck a truth he could not deny. "I didn't truly know," he whispered. "About what exactly happened that night in the study? What Dad actually said to you?" "Yes. Daniel, you knew. You were standing right there. You specifically told me not to be stubborn and inconvenient. I honestly believed I was attempting to help you. You were attempting to make things easier, for yourself, for Dad's reputation, not for me." He was silent for a prolonged moment, listening to the echoes of the dissipating party. "Is this the reason you accepted the invitation?" Daniel asked finally. "Pure, unadulterated retribution." I considered the question seriously. Was this complex, meticulously planned situation simply retribution? The systematic public demolition of my family's fundamental assumptions about who I was? "No," I replied. "If my motivation were retribution, I would have executed this plan years ago. I would have called every magazine, demanded every public interview, and personally ensured that the entire world knew that Richard Harris's discarded daughter was worth exponentially more than everything he had ever managed to construct." "Then why did you come tonight? Why choose this precise moment?" "Because I am finally done." I looked around the immense, expensive room at the remnants of a party that had culminated in something neither my father nor I had ever remotely intended. For 12 long years, I have carried the enormous weight of what transpired in Dad's study. His dismissive words, the way all of you subsequently treated me after Mom's passing, the profound, constant ache of never belonging in my own family structure. I turned to face my brother directly. "Tonight, Daniel, I am actively setting that burden down, not because you have offered an apology, not because anything has fundamentally changed between us, but because I am utterly exhausted from granting all of you that kind of definitive power over me, the power to wound me by your absence, the power to define me by your casual judgment." I noticed that Daniel's eyes were visibly wet. I was strangely surprised to feel nothing at the sight of his pain. "I am genuinely sorry," he whispered, "for whatever marginal worth that statement still holds." "It holds very little worth," I confirmed, "but I appreciate the minimal effort you made to say it anyway." I left him standing there, his entire posture conveying defeat, and walked directly toward the exit. My hands were shaking. I hadn't expected that. 12 years of imagining this moment, and my body was betraying me now, trembling, like I was still the girl in the borrowed heels. I stopped in the hallway, pressed my palm flat against the wall, and forced myself to breathe. The satisfaction I had expected wasn't there. In its place was something emptier, not regret but not triumph either. Just the enormous weight of a chapter finally closing. My father intercepted me near the grand front doors. He had visibly aged in the hours since my confident arrival. The smooth, controlling host who had greeted his guests was gone, replaced by a man who looked physically smaller than I remembered, diminished and broken by the evening's shattering revelations. "Anna," he said, his voice weak. "Wait." I stopped and waited patiently. "I have no earthly idea what I can say to you." He spread his hands in a gesture of absolute helplessness I had never once witnessed from him. Everything I steadfastly believed about your life, your career path, your future, I was completely, fundamentally wrong. Yes, I agreed simply. If I had only known the truth. You would have done what, I interrupted, cutting him off. Been marginally nicer to me. Called me on Christmas, actually invited me to major family events instead of passively hoping I would permanently fade away. I never truly wanted you to fade away, Anna. Then what precisely did you want from me, Dad? He remained silent for a long, painful moment, searching for a truth he had likely never consciously acknowledged. I wanted you to fit, he confessed finally, the words thick with shame. Into the specific, comfortable life I had meticulously built, into the new family unit Margaret and I were constructing. You were relentlessly stubborn, constantly determined to execute things your own way. I genuinely didn't know how to control or handle that unique quality. So reluctantly, I gave up entirely. It was the most raw, honest, and painfully truthful statement he had ever delivered to me in my adult life. I know that is the truth, I said quietly, and that is the part that inflicted the deepest wound. Not the fact that you pushed me away, Dad, but the fact that you simply stopped trying to include me at all. Thomas appeared at my elbow, coat draped over his arm. Ready to depart, Anna. I looked at my father one last time, the man who had issued the challenge, who had spent a decade pretending I was irrelevant. I was always someone of consequence, Dad. I stated, my voice firm and clear. You simply lacked the vision to see it. And then I walked directly out the door, leaving him alone to stand among the elegant ruins of his own devastating, lifelong assumption. The morning immediately following the gala, I woke up in my New York apartment with a peculiar, unprecedented feeling in my chest. It wasn't the expected rush of triumph or the bitter taste of satisfied retribution. It was something profoundly quieter, something that felt exactly like peace. My professional phone had accumulated dozens of messages overnight. I ignored every single request. Instead, I made a strong coffee and stood at my window, silently watching the city begin its workday below. The streets were filled with thousands of anonymous people, all caught up in their own private narratives. I thought about the young girl who had first arrived here 12 years ago. She had been so profoundly wounded then. Every subsequent achievement had been partially driven by that lingering wound, a desperate, fierce need to validate her own self-worth to them. But standing here now, I finally understood something crucial. The initial anger had been a necessary fuel. The aggressive drive for success had been utterly essential. But the desperate need to prove anything to them had finally irreversibly run its course. My family knows the truth now. But knowledge itself did not possess the power to magically heal those old, deep wounds. Success, however enormous, could not erase those painful memories. What could change, I realized, was simply me. I could choose to fully let go of the need for their approval. I could stop measuring my entire life's achievement against the yardstick of their monumental failures of imagination. I could finally accept that some familial relationships were fractured beyond any meaningful repair, and that profound acceptance was not synonymous with defeat. I could finally, truly be free. The doorman buzzed to notify me of an unscheduled visitor. A few minutes later, a soft knock came at my apartment door. It was Daniel. He looked completely undone. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face unshaven, and he was still wearing the same crumpled clothes from the gala the night before. "Can I please come in?" he asked, his voice exhausted. I stepped aside and allowed him to enter my apartment. He walked into my living room and stopped immediately. "This is beautiful," he said, his voice completely hollow. "What exactly do you want, Daniel?" He turned to face me. "I couldn't sleep a wink. I kept thinking about everything you said last night, about how I knowingly chose to make things easier for myself instead of standing up and supporting you. And your conclusion, and you were absolutely right." He sank onto my large, comfortable couch. "I failed you, Anna. Not just that one night, but every single time thereafter. I knew it was morally wrong, and yet I did nothing to intervene." I sat down in the chair directly across from him. Why did you choose that, Daniel? Because it was the path of least resistance. Because Dad had always clearly favored me, and I was fundamentally terrified that if I pushed back in your defense, I would permanently lose that protection. I convinced myself that you were an adult, you were resilient, you would eventually be fine. He laughed a short, bitter sound. It turns out you were more than fine. But that undeniable success does not magically change the fact that I abandoned my sister when she genuinely needed me. I am not going to pretend that any of it is okay, I stated. Not how I was treated, not the years I spent truly believing I had been permanently erased. But I am also not going to carry that immense burden anymore. Not for your comfort, for my own liberation. I am definitively done allowing that failure of imagination to be the final chapter of my story. Daniel nodded slowly. What does that decision mean for us, Anna, moving forward? It means I do not hold hatred for you. I also do not offer you forgiveness, not in the simple, tidy way people typically use that word. But I am willing to attempt something entirely new, a relationship that is entirely disconnected from the past. Just two deeply flawed people attempting to figure out if there is any remnant of a relationship worth the tremendous effort of saving. I would like that possibility, he confessed. I don't believe I deserve it, but I desperately want it. You absolutely do not deserve it. Neither did I deserve to be abandoned all those years ago. But I am choosing to offer this fragile possibility to you anyway. When Daniel finally departed, he awkwardly embraced me for the first time in over a decade. It was clumsy and brief, but it was undeniably a start. I stood in my doorway and watched him walk toward the elevator, and I felt a final definitive internal shift. The last stubborn piece of the puzzle clicked into its permanent place. I had spent 12 years of my life constructing a massive, undeniable external reality that conclusively proved my family wrong. Now I was finally ready to devote the rest of my life to constructing an internal peace that had absolutely nothing to do with them whatsoever. I was Anna Chen. I had built something real from nothing but refusal to disappear. I had survived the very people who should have loved me best. The morning light broke over the Manhattan skyline, illuminating the dust motes still suspended in the air. The city was already moving oblivious to the drama that had unfolded last night and entirely indifferent to the peace I had finally found. I closed the door in silence, a profound quiet I had spent my whole life